Welcome to Grain Steel. Today we're going to be making something a little bit different than we normally do. A friend of mine recently had a dog pass away, unfortunately, and she asked if I could make a custom urn with his name engraved in the front. So that's what we're going to be working on today. Let's hop right into it. So I'm using black walnut for this project. I just love black walnut, and I feel like you can't really go wrong unless you're not a good woodworker, and which maybe I'm not. I'm not sure. You guys can be the judge of that. Now, I started by planing all this wood to about a ½ inch thick, and then I jumped over to the table saw and cut everything to the proper dimensions. And I did cut them at 45-degree angles, just because I prefer 90-degree joints over joints that just butt together. So what you see me doing here is I'm creating space for the bottom panel and the lid to sit, so I'm cutting a notch in every single side on the top and the bottom. Now on the front panel here, I'm just cutting a little gap so that you have easy access to the lid. Now we gotta hop over to the table saw again and cut the bottom panel out and the lid. I cut the bottom panel out already, and here's me cutting out the lid. Now I'm just checking the fit of the lid, and I'm marking out where I need to make a little nub slash, I guess, handle, so you can lift the lid up and down. So I'm just using the jigsaw here, and I'm carefully cutting the nub out. Now keep in mind, at this point, I had no idea where I was headed with this little nub slash handle. I was just kind of winging it, but I'm really happy that it turned out pretty good. So what I end up doing is I grab the Dremel, and you're going to see that pretty soon, and I shape it up and make it look really nice.
Beautiful.
So before I went ahead and glued everything together, I really wanted to make sure that the engraving turned out good, just because I don't have a whole lot of experience with engraving. So I went ahead and used this transfer paper to transfer Rusty's name directly onto the face of the wood. That way it's a little bit more accurate and I'm not carving through a bunch of paper and it's like super awkward and uncomfortable. Now all you have to do here is you just slide the transfer paper behind the font that you printed out and you trace it with a pencil. And here's what it finally looks like when it's done. So this was definitely the hardest part of this process. I've seen a ton of people on YouTube carving with X-Acto knives like this, but the one thing that I did not consider is the fact that I'm using a hardwood and everybody else is using a super soft wood that's made for carving. So this process was very, very difficult, and I think I now know that the next time I do this, I'll probably just use a Dremel bit that's made for carving. So now for the glue up. This was my favorite part of the process just because it's always fun seeing everything come together, your visions finally coming together. So here I'm just applying glue to the edges of each of my pieces, and I'm sliding them together as perfectly as I possibly can to make sure that the angles line up properly at 90 degrees. And then I use the clamps and I clamp this together for about 24 hours at least. Now after 24 hours, you remove the clamps, and hopefully your piece doesn't fall apart, which mine didn't, so that's great. So finally we're back with our little nub on the lid, and we're using the Dremel to shape it up. I really didn't like the way it looked before. It was kind of blocky and thick, and it just didn't feel good to hold on to. So I ended up just making it a little more round, and it made it a little bit nicer to hold on to, and it looked better. Now I did paint these letters at this point just to see if there were any imperfections that stood out, which upon investigation there definitely were. So I came back with the Dremel bit that I should have used to carve these letters in the first place, and I just cleaned all the letters up really nicely. And now here I'm just sanding off all that dried up excess glue. Now I did end up deciding to add splines for strength and for aesthetics. So here I am marking out where my splines are going to go, and I'm going over to the table saw and I'm cutting the openings for those splines. Now, if you are cutting splines like this without a jig, just make sure that you put a stop on that saw fence so that you don't cut way too deep into your piece and ruin the entire project. Now I'm just putting glue in those openings, and I'm putting glue on the splines themselves, and I'm inserting them into the openings. Now just make sure you press these splines in nice and firmly so that there are no gaps or anything when you finally cut them flush. Now I'm just using this nifty little sander, and I'm sanding the edges of this lid to make sure that everything's smooth to the touch and you don't get splinters or anything like that. Now this part was actually kind of a big risk on my part, and I'm not sure that I should have done this, but high risk, high reward, so I went for it. So in the end of the day, after all the Dremeling, the nub on that lid didn't end up being very long. So I wanted to add a little indentation so that you could still easily grab onto that nub and lift the lid up and down. So first I used the Dremel to get the general shape of the indentation, and then I just hand sanded it the rest of the way to make sure that it was nice and feathered out, and it felt really nice. Now these splines have finally gotten some sufficient time to dry, so I just grab an old school saw and I start hacking off the excess one by one. So when you first cut those splines off, they're not going to be perfect, so you do have to come back with the sander, which is what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of sanding those rough cuts down and making sure everything's nice and smooth and seamless. I'm also going to sand the top here just to make sure that the lid and the edges are perfectly flush. Now, they are really close already because we measured properly, but if they're off by even a tiny bit, then it most likely will be noticeable and it'll honestly just bother me. So now we're finally going to paint those letters once and for all. I just decided to go with black paint just because I knew it was going to look good, and I am going to come back with polyurethane to make sure that that paint never comes off. Last but certainly not least is the finishing process. So I'm just coming back with some isopropyl alcohol and I'm wiping down this entire piece super thoroughly to make sure that there's no dust or debris or sawdust or anything like that when we go to apply the finish. For the finish for this project, I did end up using Odie's oil again. I do want to try out Rubio Monocoat in the future, but Odie's just is super easy to use and it smells good. And it just really makes the colors pop, so it's kind of just a safe bet. But anyhow, let's just get to stirring. So first we gotta open this up and start stirring it until it's about the consistency of honey, I like to say. And then we just apply a couple of dabs or a little smear and we start rubbing it in really thoroughly with a pad. Not the female kind of pad. I'm not sure that would even work. But I guess you guys can go ahead and try that out and let me know in the comments if it worked or not. Then after about an hour, you just wipe everything off and make sure you do wipe everything off because you can't wipe off too much, but you can wipe off too little. So be very thorough. And now for the grand reveal, here's what the final product ended up looking like. I thought it turned out amazing, and the contrast between that dark walnut wood and the maple splines was incredible. So hats off to me for deciding to do that. If you guys are interested in me, head over to my Tinder. Just kidding, of course. If you guys would like me to make you something out of wood, then please do head over to my Instagram or my Etsy, both of which will be linked in the description below. Other than that, if you guys like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications, and I will see you guys in the next one.